All right, let's go ahead and get started. People are filing in the room. This is the third general session. Our keynote address is going to be Dr. Stuart Gitlow. He's the executive director of the Annenberg Physician Training Program in Addictive Disease, which he started in 2005 to ensure medical student access to training that stimulates them to develop and maintain interest in working with patients with addiction. He serves as the chair of the AMA's Council on Science and Public Health. Dr. Gitlow is the past president of the American Society of Addiction Medicine and serves as ASAM's delegate to the AMA. Board certified in general addiction and forensic psychiatry, Dr. Gitlow has an active addiction medicine practice. A graduate of MIT and the Mount Sinai School of Medicine, Dr. Gitlow's psychiatric and public health training took place in Pittsburgh, following which he went to Harvard for his forensic fellowship. He now divides his time between his clinical practice in New England and his academic work with New York City. He is on faculty at both Dartmouth and Mount Sinai. Dr. Gitlow formerly produced programs for the Health Channel and ABC. Dr. Gitlow is a strong supporter of Oxford House and sits on the Oxford House Inc. Board of Directors. His presentations on addiction to Oxford House audiences have always been met with great enthusiasm and have been very informative, inspirational, and entertaining. No one works with an old-fashioned flip chart as well as he does. Now, he is not here today to be with us, but he does have a video, and it's not a flip chart, but he's still going to provide a visual aid within the recorded video. So let's sit back and enjoy Dr. Gitlow present to us.
Welcome, everybody. It's good to be here at the Oxford House convention again. So sorry I am not here to present in person. This is going to be a pandemic special, I think. Something I've gotten, unfortunately, used to over this past year or two now. But hopefully by next year, I will be able to be there in person again with you. So appreciate your forbearance during these difficult times. The title of this has always been Substance Use Disorders, a Practical Guide. Really what it boils down to is a question as to what is addiction? Everybody has their own definition. And I know from a medical perspective, we've got diagnostic criteria that we in healthcare utilize, usually from the Psychiatric Bible, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's a thick book that lists the criteria for whether or not somebody falls into one of the categories for substance use disorders. But in truth, what ends up happening is that addictive disease tends to be diagnosed by physicians or other clinicians based on something a lot less specific. Ordinarily, it's simply a question of, do you, the patient, use more or less than I, the clinician, use? And if we sit here and say to ourselves, well, I drink 5 drinks a day, patient reports he drinks 4 drinks a day, clearly he doesn't have a substance use disorder. The problem is that addictive disease doesn't have anything to do with how much you actually use. There are folks out there who have addictive disease, which is severe in nature, and yet the quantity of substances that they use is less than the quantity that, say, an average college student might use. Now, that begs the question of what does the average college student have wrong? But it also means that we're not looking at quantity. So the moment somebody says to you in a clinical exam, how much do you drink, or how many bowls of marijuana do you smoke every day, or how many oxys do you take every day? There's a problem, because that bit of information is not useful in terms of constructing a diagnosis, in terms of figuring out whether or not you have a problem. One of the things that I've often said in these lectures is the question of, do you have a limitation that you've placed on your substance use? Do you say, I don't have a problem because I don't drink in the morning, or I don't have a problem because there are some days where I don't use, and on other days I limit myself to 3 or 4 of whatever it is I'm using. And the moment somebody says that they have a limitation, a self-imposed limitation, they most likely have addictive disease, right? Because you've never sat there and said, I limit myself to 2 glasses of orange juice with my breakfast each morning. I never have more than 2. You never say that because you don't have orange juice addiction. No one does. So no one says that. So the moment somebody actually sits there and says something that relates to a limitation that is self-imposed, could be about how many times a day, or how much, or when, or where, or with whom, any of those limitations imply that there's a problem that you've already recognized, even if subconsciously, and you're doing something to readdress the issue by imposing a limitation. So the moment somebody has a limitation, there's a problem. And it doesn't matter how much it is, right? If somebody is drinking 1 drink a day and they think it's too much, or they're having medical issues as a result of that, then they say to themselves, all right, I'm only going to have 1 every other day. That's already a problem. And most likely, if we look closely, we will find other issues. I had a friend of mine years ago, this goes back to my college days, who told me about her use of marijuana, and she was certain that she didn't have a problem. And yet one of the things that she did was drove from the middle of Massachusetts up to Canada to get marijuana. And she did that every weekend or 2. And I pointed out to her how much time she was spending to get the marijuana. And her explanation was, well, it's a social activity. I'm going with other people, and we socialize as part of the process. By the same token, I've had people say how they relate to their dealer, right? How that relationship is important to them. And one of the things that often becomes difficult for folks as they get into sobriety is, I've lost my friendship with my dealer. And because what they do is they take that relationship and they imagine it as if it were a friendship. It's the sort of thing that any retailer would like to have with you, right? Walmart wants to have a relationship with you. Blue Cross Blue Shield wants to have a relationship with you. That's important to them. And they'll even send you emails and hard copy mail and occasional phone calls that offer you specials. And they offer it in a manner that suggests that they know you. We're on good terms. We can talk with one another. And that's the same thing that a good, high quality drug dealer will do as well. He will or she will form a relationship with you. And that relationship becomes something that, well, we're people, we're social animals, and we like to have relationships with other people. And this is one which engages us. So when a dealer is somebody you can no longer be in contact with, there's a sense of loss there. That sense of loss is part of what ends up driving a relapse in some cases, if the individual, the relationship is not replaced with a healthier relationship along the way. And as I'm going through these things, right, the relationship with a dealer, or the amount of time spent fetching drugs, or the issues involved in self-imposed limitations, I haven't spoken at all about the quantity or the frequency of use, neither of which are important factors. So if you're sitting down in a group and having a discussion and everyone's going around talking about how much they used, you will naturally sit there and say, my problem must not be very great because I didn't use as much as these folks used. And therefore, I don't have to take this quite as seriously as everybody else is indicating, because I didn't use that much. All right. So the moment you start thinking about quantity or frequency, you're going down the wrong path, because neither of those things have a whit to do with whether or not you actually have addictive disease. How it works in 100% of mammals, right? All mammals experience roughly the same thing as a result of their use of alcohol. And what they experience is a period of sedation. The period of sedation is interpreted by an individual in a number of different ways, but generally speaking, it's that period of sedation that is being sought, right? That's what people want as a result of their alcohol use. Now, sedation can mean many things. It can mean you fall asleep. It can mean you die because you stop breathing after a certain amount of the drug is imbibed. But it can also mean that you're a little disinhibited, more relaxed, more at peace with yourself, perhaps, better able to get along with other people, you think. All of those things are part of the sedation that one gets from alcohol. So I'm going to draw a curve here, and here we go. Let's, I'll tell you what, I'm going to take off the background so that you can see my curve. There we go. Let's go here. Okay. So what I've drawn is a vertical line and a horizontal line. The horizontal line represents time. The vertical line represents how sedated you are. And the point where the two lines meet, that's time zero. That's the point where you drink. Okay. Now you have a drink. And what you get is a curve that looks like that. The curve lasts for 2 hours. It is a period of sedation. The amplitude of that curve depends on how much you drink. So if I drink just a little bit, the curve is that smaller curve, right? I'm just a little disinhibited. If I drink a whole drink, the curve is the larger curve, showing that I'm more sedated. And if I drink enough, I go all the way down below the bottom of my line, and that means I've died, unfortunately, because I drank and I didn't throw up. All right. If you throw up, you have a chance living because you're not metabolizing all that alcohol. But the bottom line is anybody, 100% of people, you don't have to be an addict. Anybody can drink enough to die. Anybody can drink enough to be sedated, but whatever it is, it's going to last for about 2 hours, give or take. Okay. The next thing that happens after you drink your alcohol and have your 2-hour period of sedation is you get another curve. And the other curve is this one right there, okay? It's that longer curve. And what it shows is that you're just a little agitated. Not much, just a bit. If you only just notice the sedation, maybe you had half a beer and you just notice something, you'll never notice the agitation. The agitation is noticeable only after you've either had a significant amount of alcohol and then waited 3 or 4 hours, or you drank over an extended period of time. Let me draw a different curve. This is an individual who on New Year's Eve decides that it's time to have a little something before going to the New Year's Eve party. Gets to the New Year's Eve party already relaxed and disinhibited, but doesn't want to get drunk. His goal is not to get drunk. His goal is to maintain a level of disinhibition and relaxation throughout the evening. So this person drinks every couple of hours, and he gets this curve down here. Now, that's sort of an uncomfortable curve because what happens is you get disinhibited and then you go back to where you started. And then you drink again and you get disinhibited and relaxed and it feels good and okay. And so what happens is you're going up and down. No one drinks like that, right? No one wants to go back and forth. So what people do instead is they drink a steady amount about every hour. And so what they get is this bottom curve where they're maintaining a level of sedation. By maintaining a level of sedation, you feel roughly the same way throughout the evening. Every one of those sedative curves, every one of those 2-hour periods that started with your drink also sets off the agitation. But we know from the top curve that the agitation lasts longer than the sedation. It's the way the body works. You say, why does the body work that way? Well, here's why. Your body is run by your brain. Your brain has a damping effect on everything. What that means is when you go out into the cold, right? Let's say it's freezing cold outside, and your body shuts down the peripheral vasculature to maintain warmth. And your hands and your feet and your fingers and your toes get cold. Then you walk back inside. It's warm inside, but your fingers and toes still stay cold. It takes an hour or so to really warm back up because the brain has a damping effect. It responds to things, but slowly, in a manner so that you're not bouncing all over the place constantly metabolically. When alcohol comes in, it forces a sedative effect by virtue of the way it works metabolically and physiologically. The brain responds to that by pushing back, but there's this damped response. It takes much longer to push back than it does to have the initial effect. That's why that agitation lasts so much longer than the sedation and is of lower amplitude. It's not as strong. Okay, so now we go back to this guy here who drinks every hour to maintain his level of sedation. And what he's doing is basically giving himself a regular ongoing dose of alcohol to maintain the level of sedation, but not recognizing that as a result of that, he will have agitations that take place. Well, the first agitation we know is this one, right? It's that bottom curve, that top part of the curve that shows the agitation. But remember, he's drinking, by looks of it, 4 drinks. And so each drink imposes its own agitation. And you end up with that. And the agitation is now much more than the sedation that you got from the alcohol in the first place. Because every alcoholic beverage gave you a certain amount of agitation. It also gave you sedation, and you were measuring that to make sure never got drunk, right? Never had a problem. But now what happens is this time is about 4 a.m., right? That's 4 o'clock in the morning, and there you are agitated. It's why when you get home on New Year's Eve and you fall into bed and say, thank God, tomorrow's New Year's Day. I don't have to work tomorrow. I've got nothing to do. I can sleep in. But there you are at 4 o'clock in the morning, looking like this. Okay. And the reason you're looking like that is you are now agitated as a result of the alcohol you drank. In fact, the next morning you're hungover and you say, why am I hungover? I was never really drunk last night. I could have, in fact, I never exceeded the legal limit. I could have driven home safely and legally. Why am I hungover? You're hungover because you're experiencing the agitation that results from a measured constant dose of alcohol over an extended period of time. What can you do to relieve that anxiety, the agitation that you're now experiencing? Hair of the dog, have another drink, even if it's 5 in the morning. At that point, you will now have a little sedative curve that slips in there right after 4 a.m. and it lets you go back to sleep. Now, the problem is that comes with its own agitation, but at least the agitation will be more acceptable because now it'll be at about 9 in the morning or so. I'm not suggesting by any means that this is the way to deal with this, but the bottom line is this is why people deal with it this way, right? It's to move the agitation to some point later in the day. everything that I just talked about has nothing to do with addictive disease. This is the way alcohol works in 100% of mammals. Now, I just made a little horizontal line at the bottom of the sedation curves, and that shows the level of sedation that I experienced as a result of my drinking. And I drew another horizontal line over at the agitation area, and that shows how much agitation I had. And you'll see, remember time zero, where the horizontal line and the vertical line initially met? That was where we started. That means that we started at that big circle, okay? Now, where did we start? Who's to say that where you start is the same place that I would start? Or look at the person next to you. Maybe that person starts at a totally different place. So the next trick here is to figure out where we start. And here's where we get into, those of you who've seen me talk before are familiar with my sunglasses exercise. I regret that I am not here to do this, but let's do it in my absence, and let's see how it works. How many of you go out on a bright sunny day and immediately, more or less, put on a pair of sunglasses? All right, raise your hands. All right. I am guessing that roughly half the room, give or take, raised their hands. Some of you even have the sunglasses probably perched on your head, right? You are people who we call stimulus augmenters. The world is a little bright, a little too vivid, a little too noisy, a little too uncomfortable. And you would, if you could, turn it down. Right? The volume of life is too much, too great. And what you would best like to do is turn that volume knob down. Your way of dealing with brightness is to put on sunglasses. It's a drug. It works very well. It has no rebound effects, no side effects, no downsides. So as far as I'm concerned, you just fixed the broken volume knob in your brain with respect to brightness. Now, it didn't do anything for how easily irritated you are or how annoying the world can be at times. But it did help in this one area. Stimulus augmenters are people who, generally speaking, find the world to be loud and irritating and noisy. They don't tend to like nightclubs. They don't tend to like movies because the volume is up too high. They're the people who say to their kids, could you turn the music down? It's really annoying. All of those sorts of things are typical in stimulus augmenters. Now, a stimulus augmenter is one thing, but there's another group of people. How many of you in the audience didn't even, when you traveled here, didn't even bring sunglasses? Raise your hands. And I'm going to guess that about another half of the room has raised its hand. And we sit here, and those individuals are stimulus reducers. People who don't even own a pair of sunglasses or rarely wear them if they do, are people who find the world quiet, a little boring at times maybe. You, if you're a stimulus reducer, love nightclubs. They're stimulating, they're energizing. You like to turn the music up loud. You like driving in the left lane as fast as possible. If you ski, you want to ski as fast as you can. If you're out on the motorboat, you want to go as quickly as you can and do as much interesting stuff as you can. Stimulus augmenters, if they're flying in a plane and the plane is bouncy because there's turbulence, they hate it. Stimulus reducers, that's great. They can take a nap in the middle of the turbulence, all right? This difference between stimulus augmenters and stimulus reducers, if we graph it, it ends up being a curve that looks like this, right? There is what we call a normal distribution among the population. Half of them are stimulus augmenters, half of them are stimulus reducers, but the bulk of the population is right in the middle, right? Just like IQ, just like height, just like weight, just like metabolic rate, heart rate, blood pressure. All of these things are normally distributed in the population. And so most people are in the middle. Well, if you take most people and you give them alcohol, they will say, that was interesting. They can take it or leave it. The majority of the public can take or leave alcohol. If you give a stimulus augmenter alcohol, they'll say, oh, that feels much better. I feel the way I think everybody else feels all the time. In fact, I'd like to feel this way all the time, right? Now, it doesn't mean that all stimulus augmenters have problems with alcohol. What it does mean is that everybody who has a problem with alcohol is a stimulus augmenter. Because if you give a stimulus reducer alcohol, they feel worse, right? It makes them feel, remember, they find the world to be slow, boring, not energizing. The last thing they want to do is turn their volume knob down. So if we look at the room where you all identified yourself as stimulus augmenters or stimulus reducers, you should be able to say the stimulus augmenters like opiates, they like sedatives, and they like alcohol, right? If you wear sunglasses and love sunglasses, put them on immediately upon going outside, you're in that category. Alcohol, sedatives, opiates. On the other hand, if you're a stimulus reducer, you'd like to turn the volume knob up a little bit, and you like methamphetamine, cocaine, Adderall, Vyvanse, any of those things are going to be your drug of choice, right? Maybe you love coffee. Whatever it is, it's going to be something that turns the volume knob up a little bit. And what I'd like you to do right now is raise your hands if I guessed your drug of choice or class of drug correctly. And what we usually see in this case is the vast majority of the audience raises its hand, and hopefully that's what we've gotten this time. What it means, what it suggests, is that there is a way of predicting ahead of time what drug you might be interested in. Well, if I can predict ahead of time what drug you might be interested in, that's a nice way to start looking at things like prevention in kids. So somebody years ago took a group of mothers who had alcoholism, tested them, and found that they had stimulus augmentation. They perceived the world as brighter and more vivid and more irritating than it really was. Well, we knew that would happen. But then this person looked at their children. Now, they were young kids. They were 8, 9, 10 years old. And she said, let's see if the kids are stimulus augmenters. And lo and behold, they were. The vast majority of the kids of mothers who were stimulus augmenters and who had alcohol use disorder also were stimulus augmenters. Now, they had never picked up alcohol. So being a stimulus augmenter has nothing to do with drug use. It's not you drink and you break something in the brain and something goes wrong and that's the disease. No, something's wrong before the person ever uses the drug for the very first time. So now we sit here and say, okay, should we tell all stimulus augmenters you can't drink alcohol, you can't have Xanax, no Valium, Librium, Ativan, Klonopin, and no opioids ever? Right? Is that what we should tell them? It actually isn't a bad idea. If we did tell them that, we would probably get rid of that addiction to opiates and alcohol, pretty quickly if they followed the instruction. Most people, won't follow the instruction. They'll say, I'll try it just this once, and then we're off to the races. But we can certainly have the idea that these are individuals worth following. All right, now, take this curve. I've drawn in stimulus augmenter and stimulus reducer, all right? So one group is on one side, one group's on the other side. And now what we're gonna do, look at my arrow, and you'll see I've tilted the normal curve on its side and put it on that original curve about alcohol, meaning that one group, the stimulus augmenters, start out at the top. All right, let's regroup. I'm going to draw the curve again. And this time, there's one person. Okay, I've drawn two curves for you. The first curve is the one you're familiar with. It's a normal person who's right in the middle of the stimulus augmentation curve, having their period of sedation. The other person is one who starts out as a stimulus augmenter. And this is the individual who says to him or herself at the time that they first drank, boy, I feel right after having my alcohol. I feel better, and I feel like I always thought I should feel in the first place. That's because everybody starts in a different place on the curve. Well, if the normal person feels a little agitated after their use, the person who was uncomfortable to begin with, now getting their agitation from the alcohol, well, they feel worse than they did to start. And so they now feel terrible. And they'd like to address that feeling, right? It's grossly uncomfortable, more so than they are to start with. And that's why what I often say to my patients with addictive disease, once we get you detoxed, and once all the post-acute withdrawal symptoms are gone, which takes about a year, right? Sleep takes 12 to 18 months to return to normal in anybody who's been drinking for a steady period of time. So post-acute withdrawal takes a year, year and a half. Once you're at the year and a half, you are now back not to normal, but to your baseline, where you started in the first place. Well, your baseline was a place where when you were initially exposed to the drug, you said, that feels much better. How can I do that repetitively and not have any problems with it? Well, that's a perfect place for relapse to take place, is right there at the point where you're done with detox, you've gone through residential, you've had your year putting your life back together, you've got money in your pocket, you've got your spouse back, your kids maybe will talk to you again, and you've got that 9 to 5 thing going, everything's working out, but you're uncomfortable, just as you were at the very beginning. We've done nothing to address the underlying disease. All we've done is address the results of the substance use that you used to try to address that underlying disease. The underlying disease, addiction, is I am uncomfortable in my own skin, and I am trying to make that better, right? The uncomfortableness might be interpreted as depression. It could be interpreted as anxiety, or it could be interpreted as simple discomfort with things, the world, my relatives, my kids, my parents, my spouse, whatever. All of those things. I don't like work. I don't like, even leisure activities leave me cold. Whatever it is that you find uncomfortable, that's where you started. And that's the thing that needs to be addressed in order to address addictive disease. So now we get into this question. The big question is this: why is it that people, not everybody with stimulus augmentation, goes down this path? Why is it that not everybody who's a stimulus reducer goes down this path? Only some people do. Why? What's different between those who are uncomfortable and pick up drugs to deal with it, and those who are uncomfortable and don't? And that brings us to another observation that was made back in the late 1960s by a group of physicians, largely in New York State. What they discovered was that all of their patients with addictive disease had a poor relationship with the parent of the same sex during their formative years. So if they're a guy, they had a bad relationship with their dad. Their dad was irresponsible, inconsistent, drunk, punitive, nasty, unsupportive, absent, away, fooling around with 10 other women and whatever, but something where the boy did not look up to dad. Now, it's a little more vicious and psychological than that. And again, my apologies to those of you who've heard me talk. I'll tell the same story that I tell every year. This is largely for the newcomers. Imagine you're 6 or 7 years old and you've been asked to play baseball with your friends for the first time. And your friends know that you've never played baseball. They really don't want you to play, but they need a ninth player. And so off you go. It's a bright sunny day. It's nice out. And you go with them. You're very excited to be playing baseball with these older kids for the first time. Well, they know you're not very good, so they put you in right field. For those of you who don't play baseball, right field in little kid baseball is where nothing at all happens. So you're standing out there bored to death. You don't know the rules. You're not sure what's going on. You're pretty far away from the action. But eventually, a ball comes your way. Well, there it is. It took you a while to notice it because you were busy looking at the clouds and trying to figure out what they looked like. And you hear everybody yelling, and then you see the ball. You go over to get the ball. It's a little too big for your hand, and you're not really sure what to do with it, but you see some people running, and you figure, throw it to the running person. Oh, that's wrong, right? You should not be doing that, but you do. And off goes the ball to the wrong person. The kids miss the play. And of course, they lose the game, and it's your fault. Never mind, it was just one play in the middle of 9 innings, but it's your fault. They make fun of you. They tease you mercilessly. And you're very upset knowing that you'll never get this opportunity again. You go home embarrassed, red-faced, chagrined, and you go to your old man and you say, Dad, I feel awful, right? This is what happened. Dad looks at you and says, I seem to recall the exact same thing happened to me when I was your age. Tell you what, let's grab a ball. We'll go out in the backyard and I will teach you how to play baseball so that this never happens to you again. Great, Dad. And they go out and they have a good time. But that's not the dad my patients have. My patients have the dad where they share this story and Dad says, oh my God, Tommy, you really suck at everything you do, don't you? And laughing, he walks off, right? Tommy, at that point, learned something critically important. What he learned are 2 things. One is, if I share my innermost feelings with somebody close to me, I will get hurt. And I'll get hurt in a manner that leaves me feeling worse than I felt in the first place. So I've learned not to share my innermost feelings with people close to me. Why did I say 2 things? Because there's 2 components there. One of them is innermost feelings. The other component is sharing, right? Both are important because what happens when I look at my patients for the first time and I say, I'd like you to go to an AA meeting, right? Imagine I have a diabetic patient. And the diabetic patient comes in having great difficulties because their blood sugars are brittle and they're having difficulty deciding what to eat and how to deal with with the medical difficulties that are resulting from their diabetes. And I say, look, all of this can get better. All you need to do is go into a room full of 50 diabetics. You stand up at the front, say, hi, my name's Bill. I'm a diabetic. And launch off into a description of some of the difficulties you've experienced recently. And everybody will say, it will come up to you and talk about it. And they'll all sit around and talk about the difficulties you've had with diabetes. And I promise you, your problems with diabetes will go away so long as you do this every day, right? Well, if that were true, they would jump up, hug me, and run to the next Diabetic Anonymous meeting, right? Because that'd be great. There'd be nothing wrong with that. But my folks with addictive disease, I look at and I say, listen, if you go and you share with these other people, you will get better. You will end up feeling better. You'll end up with money in your pocket and a job and a spouse and kids and people who like you and friends and all of that. And so they go to the meeting. And I say, did you go to the meeting? Well, yeah, sort of. What do you mean, sort of? Well, I stood outside and I saw there was a meeting going on inside. Well, no, that's not quite it. I want you to try again. All right, I'll try again. did you go to the meeting? Yeah, I went to the meeting. What did you do? I got there and I attended. Yeah. When did the meeting start? 6. When did you get there? About 20 after. Where'd you sit? In back? Did you raise your hand? No. Did you talk to anybody? No. What did you do after the meeting? Well, I had left already. When did you leave? 6:40? So yeah, it's that sort of thing. It's like pulling teeth. Why? Because these people with addiction, have learned at age 6, 7, 8 that they can't do 2 things: share or talk about intimate feelings, because they're bad. They make them feel worse. That's the difference between a stimulus augmenter with addictive disease and a stimulus augmenter who does not have addictive disease. One of them did not learn that lesson. One of them had the dad who was there for them, or the mom who was there for them when they said, Mom, Uncle Jim is diddling me at night. And mom says, oh, that seems to happen to a lot of women. It happened to me. There's nothing we can do about it. Just deal with it. Or, no, you're lying. Uncle Jim would never do that, right? That mom, right? She just lost all respect, right? And so little girl grows up saying to herself, I don't want to be anything like mom. And I certainly don't want to share anything with anybody because I know it doesn't work. And I end up just feeling worse, right? So those are the typical boy and girl stories. And so what we end up with are people who have been traumatized by their efforts to share their thoughts and feelings with somebody important to them, and who then grow up and have the misfortune of having either stimulus augmentation or stimulus reduction to such an extent that they're uncomfortable to begin with. It takes both of those components, the discomfort that's genetic and the learned activity of not sharing with other people, despite the fact that we're herd animals and we're supposed to be part of a herd. People with addictive disease generally have difficulty being part of the herd. You've all had to relearn how to do that. That was much of what AA and 12-step and living in an Oxford house is all about. It's about learning how to be social, because you didn't learn it when you were 5, 6, 7, 8. You're learning it now. So there's 2 ways of approaching the treatment of addictive disease. One is fix the genetic problem. Make it so that instead of being uncomfortable, you're comfortable, right? The second would be fixing the psychological trauma that took place when you were brought up. That's what you've gone through, right? That's Oxford House and so forth fixes that. You're reparented in a way, re-socialized or socialized or parented for the very first time. That's why this works. It turns you into somebody who still has addictive disease, who still has some discomfort, but who now has have new coping strategies for dealing with that discomfort. Now, some people have talked about and said, well, then really what I'm doing is self-medicating. And some people get confused and say, well, what I'm self-medicating is my anxiety, or what I'm self-medicating is my depression. Don't think of it as 2 different disease states, because it's not, it's one. It's all one thing. The likelihood is that you don't have 2 diseases. The likelihood is that you have one, right? Now, it's certainly possible. And I don't mean to offend those of you who genuinely have major depressive disorder and addiction to some alcohol or some other drug, right? There are probably some of you out in the audience right now, but most of you who were told you have a dual diagnosis probably don't. You were probably treating the underlying addictive disease, which you were interpreting as either depression or anxiety. Okay. The other way of treating this illness is to treat the genetic issue. And we talked about that a little bit, but I didn't go into how, because there is no way of doing it. If you have stimulus augmentation, I can't fix it. What we can do, we've got only one drug that really works here, and that's buprenorphine or Suboxone. And it only works for people with opiate use disorder. And what it does is it addresses the genetic abnormality in such a way as to make it so that the individual will not experience significant cravings and will be able to get their life back. And that's why there's often this disconnect where folks in your position who are, Oxford House 12 step and we're approaching our treatment this way, look at the other folks who are treating it with, say, Suboxone, and aren't going to 12 step and aren't doing AA, and saying they're doing it wrong. No, they're doing it differently. And both parties will end up with a problem. Your difficulty, if you do Oxford House 12 step, is that, all right, now I'm still at my baseline, which is uncomfortable. Thankfully, I have this new coping method for dealing with it. The folks on the Suboxone are still traumatized by what happened to them in their youth. They haven't gone through reparenting. They haven't been resocialized, and they may end up with significant interpersonal difficulties as a result. So both groups end up with something that needs to be addressed long-term, right? In your case, it's going to be that you need long-term participation in activity, typically in a 12-step program, that over time you'll be able to lessen the degree of activity, but never eliminate, because there'll always be that component that's still waiting there. All right. So we've talked about two things: genetics, we've talked about environment. There is a third piece. I'll spend just a few minutes on this because the third building block is crucial. You can make a person with addictive disease by traumatizing them as a youth and then watching to see if their DNA is incorrect in some way or off the, on one edge of the curve or another. But there's a third thing. There also needs to be availability of drug. The drug has to be there, because if we were living in a time and a place where there were no drugs, right? Let's say that before you ever used for the first time, I sent you to Mars, right? And on Mars, we have a colony, and the colony does not have any drugs available. There you'd be, uncomfortable, not really able to get along well with other people, but you're making it, and you never go all the way downhill as a result of the substance use. You would get through your life. No one would ever identify you as having addictive disease. You'd be a little difficult to get along with, perhaps, and that might be as far as it goes. So the third building block of addictive disease is that the drug has to actually be available. Well, we had an amazing public health success in this country. And no one ever thinks of it that way, because the biggest success we ever had was prohibition. During prohibition of alcohol, 100 years ago, alcohol was not allowed to be transported or produced. You could own it, but you couldn't just go into a store and buy it. And at that time, as a result, there was some illegal use of alcohol, obviously. And we all know about that. We all know about the gangs that made, bootlegged alcohol across state lines and all of that. But what most people don't realize is that during Prohibition, there was a remarkable drop in medical difficulties due to alcohol use. There was a drop in fires. There was a drop in accidents. There was a drop, obviously, in liver failure. All of those things improved by almost 2/3. Right? A huge savings of money to the country, but it was a political failure. Not because it was a public health failure, but because the majority of people wanted to be able to drink. And as we know, the majority of people don't have addictive disease. So what they ended up doing was to the misfortune of all of you, right? It made it so that the drug was readily available. We are going through this same exercise right now with marijuana. We've taken a drug that was essentially prohibited, and we're making it more readily available through a variety of legal and political maneuvers. As we do that, the number of people who will be exposed to the drug, despite the fact that it was generally available even back when it was prohibited completely, the number of people who are exposed to it is increasing. And therefore, the number of people who end up discovering that it solves whatever their ailment is will increase. And the number of people with problems secondary to its use will increase. It will still be a minority of those who use. And nevertheless, it will be almost double the number of people who had problems with marijuana before the laws ended up becoming more liberal relative to its use. So the first building block is the genetics. The second building block is the childhood trauma. The third building block is how readily available is the drug. Of course, as we look back and we say to ourselves, why did the opiate crisis begin? One of the reasons it began was that we made marijuana more readily available. We began growing it in this country. Apparently, the marijuana grown in this country is of good quality. And so the people who used to export marijuana to this country no longer found it to be the cash crop that it used to be. And they looked for an alternative. And they began sending us opiates, pure heroin, instead. And they made more money from that because we now had marijuana available in the country for less money and better quality. So that was one of the major issues contributing to the opiate crisis. In any event, we are just about out of time. Again, my apologies for not joining you in person this year. I look forward to seeing you next time. Please feel free to drop me an email, send in comments, let folks know what you thought, and any questions you got, I'd be happy to answer. I'm sure somebody there will give an email address at oxfordhouse.org to which you can drop some questions. They'll forward them over to me, and then I'll answer them all for you. But I look forward to seeing you in person next year. Thanks again.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Gitlow.